The headlights disappeared behind a stand of ancient cedars, but Margaret knew they'd reappear in less than 3 minutes. She'd timed that curve countless times over the decades, first out of paranoia, then habit, finally ritual. The red numbers on the microwave clock glowed 6:47 a.m. Too early for the propane delivery, too late for anyone who'd gotten lost in the maze of logging roads that crisscrossed the Olympic Peninsula. Augustus's whining grew more insistent, accompanied by the distinctive scratch of claws against reinforced steel. The basement door, disguised as a pantry behind false shelving, rattled softly. He knew. Somehow, he always knew when strangers approached before their vehicles even turned onto the property. Margaret's hands began their familiar tremor, the same one that had plagued her during every difficult surgery. Every lie told to protect him. Every sleepless night wondering if today would be the day everything unraveled. She set down her coffee and pressed her palms flat against the kitchen counter, forcing herself to breathe. The compound sprawled across 12 acres that her grandfather had cleared in 1942, back when the government was buying up remote properties for strategic purposes. 4 generations of Thorns had lived here, but only 3 people knew what lay beneath the main house. Margaret, her late husband Robert, God rest his soul, and her daughter Sarah, who moved to Portland last year, claiming she needed space to process everything. What Sarah really needed was distance from the weight of impossible truth. The headlights reappeared, twin beams cutting through the mist like surgical lamps. Margaret counted 3 vehicles now, black SUVs with government plates. She'd bet her veterinary license on it. In 50 years of hiding Augustus, she'd developed an eye for federal vehicles the way other people recognized bird species. Her grandchildren would be here in 4 hours for their weekly visit. 8-year-old Emma and 10-year-old Josh, who thought Augustus was just an unusually large and shy family dog who lived in the special room because of his anxiety. They'd grown up playing gentle games through the reinforced door, reading him stories, sharing secrets they thought their dog couldn't understand. If only they knew Augustus understood every word, and remembered all of them. The basement door rattled harder. Augustus was 7 feet tall when he stood on his hind legs, which he did more often than any normal canine should. His intelligence had always been the most unsettling aspect of their arrangement. Those amber eyes held a depth of awareness that made Margaret question everything she thought she knew about consciousness, about humanity, about what the government had really been trying to create in those underground facilities. The files Robert had stolen from the Department of Defense before his death painted a picture of experimentation that made her veterinary training feel quaint by comparison. Project Lycon, they'd called it. Greek mythology meets genetic manipulation. Augustus wasn't just a failed experiment, he was proof of concept. The lead SUV crested the final hill, its headlights sweeping across the wraparound porch where Margaret had spent countless evenings reading medical journals, while Augustus paced his underground chambers. She could see the silhouettes now, 3 figures in the front vehicle, probably more in the others. They drove with the careful precision of people who'd done this before, who knew exactly what they were looking for. Augustus fell silent. That silence was somehow worse than his agitation. In 5 decades together, Margaret had learned to read his moods better than she'd ever read her late husband's. Augustus only went quiet when he sensed real danger, not the mailman, not the occasional hiker who wandered too close to their property, but genuine threat. The vehicles pulled into her circular driveway with military precision, engines purring to a stop in perfect synchronization. Margaret watched 3 figures emerge from the lead SUV, 2 men in dark suits and a woman with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. Their breath misted in the cold morning air as they surveyed the property with the methodical attention of crime scene investigators. The woman looked directly at Margaret's kitchen window and smiled. Margaret's blood turned to ice water. That smile held no warmth, no diplomatic courtesy. It was the smile of someone who'd finally found what they'd been searching for, someone who held all the cards and knew it. The basement door gave one final soft rattle. Then Augustus's footsteps retreated into the deeper chambers Robert had excavated during the Carter administration, chambers that went down 30 feet into the mountain's bedrock. chambers that had kept him safe through 5 presidents, 3 wars, and countless nights when Margaret wondered if she was protecting a miracle or harboring a monster. As the federal agents approached her front door with measured steps, Margaret realized that after 50 years of questions, she was finally going to get answers. She just wasn't sure she wanted to hear them. The doorbell rang once, sharp and authoritative in the morning stillness. Margaret's hand froze inches from the front door handle. The brass knob, polished smooth by decades of her family's touch, reflected the distorted image of her face back at her. 67 years old, silver hair escaping from its morning bun, worry lines etched deep around eyes that had seen too much. The doorbell rang again, followed by a measured knock that spoke of infinite patience and absolute authority. "Dr. Thorne, we'd like to speak with you, please." The voice belonged to the silver-haired woman. Professional, courteous, with just enough steel underneath to make it clear this wasn't really a request. Margaret had heard that tone before, from federal inspectors who'd occasionally visited her veterinary practice over the years, always asking seemingly innocent questions about unusual cases, rare specimens, anything that might have fallen outside normal parameters. She'd always wondered if those visits were random or if someone, somewhere, was still looking. Now she had her answer. Margaret straightened her shoulders and opened the door, drawing on every ounce of composure she'd cultivated through 5 decades of living a double life. The 3 agents stood arranged in a careful triangle on her porch, the woman at the center flanked by the 2 men who kept their hands visible but ready. Their eyes swept past her into the house's interior with the practiced efficiency of people trained to catalog everything in seconds. "I'm Dr. Margaret Thorne," she said, matching their professional tone. "How can I help you?" The woman stepped forward, producing a leather credential case with fluid precision. "Agent Patricia Vance, Department of Homeland Security. These are Agents Morrison and Chen. We need to discuss a matter of national security with you, Dr. Thorne. May we come in?" Margaret's veterinary training kicked in. The same calm assessment she used when facing down a panicked horse or an aggressive dog. Read the room. Identify the threats. Control what you could control. Of course. Would you like coffee? I was just making a fresh pot. It was a delaying tactic, and they all knew it, but Agent Vance nodded with what might have been approval. That would be appreciated. Margaret led them through the foyer, past family photographs that told the carefully curated story of 4 generations of Thornes. Her grandfather in his Navy uniform, her father receiving his engineering degree, her own veterinary school graduation, Sarah's wedding day, the grandchildren's school pictures. Normal people living normal lives in their not-so-normal house. She guided them away from the kitchen, too close to the basement entrance, and into the formal living room that overlooked the forest. Robert had always called it her Sunday room because she only used it for company that required her best behavior. The agents arranged themselves with tactical awareness, Vance taking the chair that faced both doorways while Morrison and Chen positioned themselves to cover the room's blind spots. "You have a beautiful property," Vance said, accepting the coffee mug Margaret offered. "Very isolated, perfect for someone who values privacy." "My grandfather built the original cabin in 1942, Margaret replied, settling into her own chair with practiced calm. "I've been here my whole life. It's peaceful. And your family?" "The files indicate you have a daughter, 2 grandchildren." Files. Of course they had files. Margaret's hands wanted to shake, but she kept them steady through sheer force of will. "Sarah lives in Portland now. Emma and Josh visit most weekends." "They're coming today?" Chen spoke for the first time, consulting what looked like a standard tablet, but probably contained information that would terrify her. "This afternoon. They love spending time here. Lots of space to run around, fresh air. City kids don't get enough of that." Margaret thought of Emma and Josh, of their excited voices calling out to Augustus through the basement door, of the elaborate games they'd invented that let them interact with their special dog without ever seeing him directly. Hide and seek through the ventilation system. Story time with Augustus listening from behind the walls. Tea parties where they'd slide cookies through the mail slot Robert had installed in the door. Her grandchildren's laughter was the soundtrack of her retirement, the proof that love could flourish even in the shadow of impossible secrets. They were everything good and innocent in her world, and these agents represented everything that could destroy that innocence. Dr. Thorne. Vance leaned forward slightly. We're not here about your family. We're here because we believe you may be in danger. Margaret's coffee mug stopped halfway to her lips. Danger? 50 years ago, you treated some unusual cases as a young veterinarian. Cases that brought you into contact with certain government programs. Vance's voice carried careful precision. Programs that created things that shouldn't exist. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Outside, the morning mist swirled through the ancient cedars that had watched over her family's secrets for decades. Somewhere below their feet, Augustus waited in chambers that had become both sanctuary and prison. Margaret set down her mug and met Agent Vance's steady gaze. I think you'd better tell me exactly why you're here. Agent Vance reached into her briefcase and withdrew a manila folder thick with documents. She placed it on the coffee table between them, with the careful precision of someone handling evidence. The folder's tab bore a single word in block letters. Lycon. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen that designation in over 40 years, not since Robert had smuggled the original files out of the Pentagon in 1982. The name belonged to her nightmares and her deepest fears. The confirmation that Augustus wasn't just some abandoned animal, but part of something vast and terrible. Project Lycon was officially terminated in 1974, Vance continued, her eyes never leaving Margaret's face. 12 subjects were created between 1968 and 1973. 11 were successfully disposed of. The euphemism hit Margaret like a physical blow. Disposed of. As if Augustus's brothers and sisters, because that's what they were, weren't they, had been nothing more than failed laboratory equipment. She thought of Augustus's intelligence, his capacity for joy when the grandchildren visited, the way he sometimes hummed along to the classical music she played during his medical examinations. The 12th subject disappeared during the facility's decommission, Agent Morrison added, consulting his tablet, along with certain classified materials and one Dr. Robert Thorne, who was working security detail during the shutdown. Margaret's hands found each other in her lap, fingers interlacing to stop their trembling. Robert's face flashed through her memory. Young, idealistic, horrified by what he'd discovered in those underground laboratories. He'd been 26 when he'd made the choice that would define both their lives, when he'd called her in the middle of the night and said simply, Maggie, I need your help. There's something here that's going to die if we don't do something. Robert was my husband, she said quietly. He passed away 3 years ago. We're aware. Vance's expression softened slightly, the first crack in her professional facade. Dr. Thorne, we're not here to prosecute crimes from 50 years ago. We're here because something else has survived from Project Lycon, and it's not as stable as what your husband rescued. The words hung in the air like smoke. Margaret felt the familiar weight of Augustus moving through the chambers below them, probably listening to every word through the ventilation system Robert had designed to carry sound. He would understand the implications better than she wanted to admit. 3 weeks ago, a family of 5 was found dead in their cabin near Mount Baker, Chen said, opening his own folder. The photographs he placed on the table made Margaret's veterinary training recoil in horror. The local sheriff blamed a bear attack initially, but the forensics don't match any known wildlife. Margaret forced herself to look at the images. The devastation was absolute. Walls shredded, furniture destroyed, and worse things she didn't want to process. But it was the claw marks that made her blood run cold. Too precise, too deliberate. These weren't the random slashes of a panicked animal. 2 days later, a research station 20 miles away went dark, Vance continued. When the state police arrived, they found something similar. 7 researchers, all dead. Same pattern of destruction. Whatever killed those people is hunting systematically, Morrison added. Moving south through the national forest. At this rate, it'll reach populated areas within weeks. Margaret's mind raced through the implications. Augustus had never shown aggression toward humans, quite the opposite. But if there was another subject from Project Lycon out there, one that hadn't been raised with love and patience, one that had somehow survived in the wild for 5 decades, "What makes you think I can help?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Vance leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Because we know you've been caring for Subject 12. Because after 50 years of protective care, it's the only one of its kind that might be able to track what's out there, the only one that might be able to stop it." The admission hung between them like a confession. They knew. They'd always known. Augustus had never been truly hidden. He'd been allowed to exist because someday, somehow, they might need him. Margaret thought of her grandchildren, due to arrive in 3 hours with their backpacks full of books to read to Augustus, their pockets stuffed with treats they thought were for a shy dog. She thought of Emma's laugh echoing through the house, of Josh's serious voice explaining his latest school project to an audience he couldn't see but trusted completely. She thought of families like theirs, innocent people who had no idea that something ancient and hungry was moving through the forests, leaving only devastation in its wake. "If I help you," Margaret said slowly, "what happens to Augustus afterward?" Vance's smile was sad and knowing. "Dr. Thorne, if you don't help us, there might not be an afterward for anyone." The choice Margaret had been dreading for 50 years had finally arrived, delivered by federal agents on a misty morning while her oldest secret listened from the shadows below. Margaret stared at the photographs scattered across her coffee table, each image a testament to violence she could barely comprehend. The coffee in her mug had gone cold, but she couldn't bring herself to move. Below them, Augustus had gone completely silent. No footsteps, no settling sounds, nothing. Even he seemed to understand that everything they'd built together balanced on the edge of a knife. "You're asking me to turn him into a weapon," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Agent Vance leaned back in her chair, studying Margaret with the intensity of someone trying to read a complex equation. "We're asking you to let him be what he was created to be." "No." The word came out sharper than Margaret intended. "Augustus wasn't created to be anything. He's become what he is because Robert and I chose to love him instead of fear him, because my daughter sang him lullabies when he had nightmares, because my grandchildren trust him with their secrets." "Dr. Thorne," Morrison interjected, "with all due respect, sentiment won't stop what's out there from reaching Seattle." Margaret's hands tightened around the mug until her knuckles went white. She thought of Emma, who'd spent her last visit teaching Augustus a clapping game through the basement door, her 8-year-old voice patient and encouraging as she helped him match the rhythm. She thought of Josh, who'd appointed himself Augustus's personal librarian, carefully selecting books he thought their special dog would enjoy. Her grandchildren believed in magic because Augustus had shown them that impossible things could be gentle. How could she explain that their beloved family secret might be needed to hunt down his own kind? "You don't understand what you're asking," Margaret said. "Augustus has never been outside these chambers, not once in 50 years. The forest, other people, the world beyond this house, it would terrify him." "The files suggest these subjects adapt quickly," Chen said, consulting his tablet with clinical detachment. "The files." Margaret's voice turned bitter. "The files don't mention that Augustus counts the days between visits from the children. They don't mention that he's learned to paint with watercolors because Emma thought he might enjoy it, or that he can recite entire chapters of Harry Potter because Josh reads to him every weekend." She stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the forest where something terrible was moving closer to innocent families. The morning mist clung to the trees like secrets, and for a moment she could almost imagine that none of this was happening, that the agents would pack up their horrible photographs and drive away, leaving her to prepare for Emma and Josh's arrival. But the weight of 50 years pressed down on her shoulders. All those nights she'd lain awake wondering if she and Robert had made the right choice. All those moments when Augustus's intelligence had seemed almost human, when she'd caught herself thinking of him not as a rescued creature but as family. "What if he refuses?" she asked without turning around. "Ma'am?" Vance's voice carried careful neutrality. "What if I ask him, and he says no? Because he will have a choice in this, Agent Vance. I won't force him into anything." The silence behind her stretched long enough that Margaret finally turned back to face them. All three agents wore expressions of poorly concealed surprise, as if the concept of Augustus having agency in this decision had never occurred to them. "Dr. Thorne," Vance said slowly, "we need to be clear about something. This isn't a request. That creature down there is government property, created with taxpayer funding for a specific purpose. We've allowed this arrangement to continue because it served our interests, but—" "Allowed?" Margaret's voice cracked like a whip. "You've allowed a sentient being to exist in my care for 50 years, and now you want to reclaim him like an overdue library book?" "The situation has changed," Morrison said. "Every day we delay, more people die." Margaret closed her eyes and saw Emma's face, bright with excitement as she'd described her latest art project last weekend. She saw Josh's serious expression as he'd asked if Augustus ever got lonely, if there were other dogs like him who might want to be friends. Her grandchildren understood love instinctively, the way children always did. They'd accepted Augustus without question because Margaret had taught them that family came in many forms. But how could she explain that their trust might be the very thing that destroyed him? "I need time," she said. "Dr. Thorne." "I need time," Margaret repeated, steel entering her voice. "To talk to him, to explain what's happening, to let him understand what you're asking of him." Vance exchanged glances with her colleagues, some silent communication passing between them. "How much time?" Margaret thought of Emma and Josh, their car probably already packed with books and games for their weekend visit. "Give me until tonight. Let me have this afternoon, with my grandchildren, without them knowing their world is about to change forever." The weight of the choice settled around her like a shroud. 50 years of protection, of normal weekend visits and bedtime stories, balanced against the lives of strangers she'd never meet. Augustus stirred below them, a whisper of movement that sounded almost like a sigh. The sound of Augustus moving below broke the spell that had held the room captive. Margaret watched Agent Vance's eyes flick toward the floor, calculating, cataloging. Even his breathing had become intelligence to be gathered. 6 hours, Vance said finally. "We'll establish a perimeter around the property, maintain surveillance. If your family arrives as scheduled, we'll keep our distance. But Dr. Thorne, if that thing poses any threat to civilians—" "His name is Augustus." The words came out harder than Margaret intended. "And he has never, not once in 50 years, shown aggression toward my family." But even as she said it, Margaret felt the foundation of her certainty cracking. How well did she really know Augustus? How well could anyone know a creature born in government laboratories, shaped by experiments she'd never fully understood? The files Vance had brought contained specifications and procedures, but nothing about what those early years had done to his mind, his instincts, his very nature. The agents gathered their materials with practiced efficiency. Morrison pocketed his tablet while Chen collected the photographs Margaret couldn't bear to look at anymore. Only Vance lingered, studying Margaret with something that might have been sympathy. "Dr. Thorne, for what it's worth, we know what you and your husband did. The care you've provided, the life you've given that creature. It wasn't unnoticed. But sentiment can't change what's coming." Margaret followed them to the door, her legs moving through sheer force of habit. The storm had intensified, turning the afternoon sky the color of old pewter. Through the rain she could see black vehicles positioning themselves at strategic points around her property. Her sanctuary had become a staging ground. After the agents disappeared into the grey afternoon, Margaret stood in her foyer listening to the silence. 50 years of careful routine, of protecting Augustus while building a life around their secret, and now everything balanced on a conversation she'd never imagined having. She descended the basement stairs slowly, each step echoing in the chambers Robert had designed with love and fear in equal measure. The main room opened before her like a cathedral of secrets, high ceilings to accommodate Augustus's 7-foot frame, soft lighting to ease his sensitive eyes, walls lined with the detritus of a life lived entirely indoors, books, art supplies, puzzle pieces scattered across custom-built tables, the accumulated evidence of intelligence nurtured in captivity. Augustus waited in his favorite corner, the one that gave him clear sight lines to both the entrance and the ventilation grate where the children's voices carried down during their visits. In the soft light, his lupine features held an almost human melancholy. His golden eyes, so much more expressive than any wolf Margaret had ever treated, met hers with understanding that made her throat tighten. "You heard," she said. It wasn't a question. Augustus nodded once, a gesture Robert had taught him decades ago. His voice, when it came, carried the careful pronunciation of someone who'd learned speech without ever having casual conversation. The children. Emma and Josh. They're coming today. Margaret sank into the chair she'd positioned beside his corner years ago, during those early sessions when they'd discovered he could learn, could communicate, could feel grief for the family he'd never known. Yes, they don't know yet. About the others. My siblings. The word came out carefully, as if he were testing its weight. I dreamed about them sometimes. In the beginning, before I understood that dreams and memories aren't always the same thing, the admission hit Margaret like a physical blow. In all their years together, Augustus had never mentioned dreams, never spoken of the time before Robert had smuggled him to safety. She'd assumed, hoped, that he'd forgotten those early horrors. "Augustus, they want you to hunt, to track what's out there and—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Stop it!" His voice held no emotion, just the same careful pronunciation he used when answering Josh's endless questions about animal behavior. "Yes, I understand." Margaret leaned forward, studying his expression for any sign of fear, resistance, anything she could use to justify refusing the agent's demands. But Augustus gazed back at her with the same steady calm he'd shown when she'd explained that Robert wouldn't be coming back. When she'd told him that his world would grow smaller, but no less loved. "I've never been outside," he said quietly. "Not once since you brought me here." I know. The weight of that isolation, chosen to protect him but chosen nonetheless, settled between them like a confession. "Augustus, you don't have to do this. Whatever they think they can force, whatever authority they claim, you have a choice." He tilted his head in the gesture that reminded her, always, that he wasn't quite human despite his intelligence. "Do I? When children die because I stayed safe in my corner?" Margaret felt the last of her objections crumble. After 50 years of protection, Augustus had become exactly what she'd hoped, a thinking, feeling being capable of moral choice. The tragedy was that his first real choice meant leaving the only home he'd ever known. Outside, Emma and Josh were getting closer with every mile, eager to spend another weekend with their mysterious family secret. Augustus stood, unfolding to his full, imposing height. "When do we tell them?" he asked. Margaret's question hung in the air between them like a prayer, waiting for an answer that would never come. Through the basement sound system, she heard the distant crunch of gravel, Emma and Josh arriving right on schedule, their voices bright with weekend excitement even through the storm. "Grandma Maggie," Emma's voice carried through the house above them. "We brought new books." Augustus's ears pricked forward at the sound, a response so automatic it seemed written into his DNA. For 50 years, those voices had been his anchor to the world beyond these chambers, proof that kindness existed outside laboratory walls. "We could tell them together," Margaret said softly. "Let them understand gradually, the way you learn to understand us." But even as she spoke, footsteps thundered overhead, Josh racing through the house in his usual weekend ritual, checking every room as if cataloguing that nothing had changed since his last visit. In moments, he'd be at the basement door with his newest selection from the school library. Augustus moved to his usual position, the spot where his shadow wouldn't fall across the gap beneath the door, where his presence could be felt but not seen. "They trust you completely," he said. "Whatever you tell them, they'll believe. The basement door opened with its familiar creak. "Augustus?" Josh's voice carried that particular tone of 8-year-old authority that never failed to make Margaret smile. "I brought you a book about wolves. Mom said it might help you understand your heritage." Margaret caught Augustus's slight smile at the word. Sarah. Her daughter had spent years crafting explanations that satisfied her children's curiosity without revealing dangerous truths. A special rescue dog with unusual features, a family pet too shy to meet strangers. Stories that worked because children wanted to believe in magic. "That's wonderful, Josh," Margaret called up the stairs. "Why don't you and Emma get settled? I'll be up in a few minutes to start dinner." Emma's voice joined the conversation. "Can we read to Augustus after we eat? I practiced the voices for all the characters." Margaret looked at Augustus, seeing her own heartbreak reflected in his golden eyes. How did you tell children that their beloved family secret might never hear another story? That bedtime might come without the sound of their voices drifting through the walls. "Always," Augustus said, loud enough for them to hear. "I always want to hear your stories." Satisfied, the children retreated upstairs, their footsteps fading into the domestic sounds of arrival. Backpacks dropping, coats hung up, the ritual of making themselves at home in their grandmother's house. In the silence that followed, Margaret felt the weight of what came next pressing down on her shoulders. "The agents are watching the house. They'll wait until the children leave, but then we go hunting," Augustus finished. He moved to the wall where Emma's latest artwork hung. A watercolor painting of a family that included a mysterious fourth figure, tall and dark and protective. "Margaret, I need you to understand something." The use of her name instead of the formal address he usually preferred sent a chill through her. In 50 years, Augustus had rarely called her anything but Dr. Thorne, a mark of respect that had gradually become affection. "The dreams I mentioned, they're not just memories. When I sleep deeply enough, I can feel them. The others from the program, most are gone, have been for decades, but—" He paused, his head tilting as if listening to something beyond her range of hearing. "There are 2 still alive. The one that's hunting, yes. But there's another." Margaret felt her blood go cold. "Another? The agents only mentioned—" "They don't know." Augustus moved to his desk, where generations of children's books lay carefully stacked. "The second one has been hiding longer than I have, learning differently than I have. It's been watching the first one hunt, following its kills, studying human behavior through violence instead of love." The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow, bad enough that one experimental creature had survived to become a killer, but 2 of them, possibly working together, possibly learning from each other's successes. "Augustus, if there are 2, if they're coordinating somehow, then what the agents are asking you to do becomes more necessary, not less." He turned back to her, and in his expression she saw something she'd never witnessed before, determination born not of obedience, but of choice. Those children upstairs, the families in the photographs, everyone who lives thinking the monsters are just stories, they don't deserve to pay for what was done to us. Above them, Emma's laughter echoed through the house, followed by Josh's serious voice explaining something he'd learned at school. Normal sounds of a normal family weekend, unchanged by the knowledge that everything they'd built together was about to shatter. Margaret stood slowly, her hands finding Augustus's massive paw. For the first time in 50 years, she truly understood what Robert had felt that night he'd called her for help. The terrible weight of choosing between certain loss and uncertain hope. "Then we tell them the truth," she said. "Not everything, but enough. They deserve to understand why you have to go." Augustus squeezed her hand gently, careful of his strength. "Will you help me be brave?" The question broke her heart and mended it simultaneously. After 50 years of protection, her family's greatest secret was asking her to help him face a world that had created him as a weapon, but raised him as a son. Upstairs, Emma called out that she was ready for dinner. Margaret took a deep breath. "Together," she said. "We'll face this together." The approach. Dinner became a performance Margaret had never imagined she'd have to give. She moved through the familiar choreography of family meals, setting plates, pouring milk, cutting Emma's sandwich into triangles the way she preferred, while her mind raced through a dozen different ways to destroy her grandchildren's innocence. Josh chattered about his science project, something ambitious involving weather patterns that made Margaret's chest tight with pride and grief. Emma interrupted every few sentences with updates about her art class, her small hands gesturing wildly as she described the painting techniques her teacher had shown them. Normal. Everything so heartbreakingly normal. "Can we take Augustus outside after dinner?" Emma asked, swinging her legs from her chair. "I want to show him the new flowers by the fence." Margaret's fork clattered against her plate. "Outside?" "Just in the backyard," Josh added quickly, sensing her distress but misunderstanding its source. "We know the rules about keeping him safe from strangers." Safe from strangers. If only they knew that tonight the strangers were federal agents positioned throughout the forest with night vision equipment and tranquilizer guns, waiting for their grandmother to hand over the creature they'd spent their entire lives loving. "Not tonight, sweetheart. The storm's too strong." Margaret forced her voice into something resembling normalcy. "Besides, Augustus has been feeling unsettled today." It wasn't entirely a lie. Through the floor, she could sense his restless movement below, pacing patterns he'd never displayed before, testing the boundaries of chambers that had been both sanctuary and prison for 5 decades. "Is he sick?" Josh's face creased with worry. At 8, he'd already decided he wanted to be a veterinarian like his grandmother, and he took Augustus's well-being with the seriousness of a professional consultation. "Not sick," Margaret said carefully, "but there are some changes coming, some decisions that need to be made." Emma perked up with the boundless optimism of 6 years old. Good changes or bad changes? The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything Margaret had built her life around. How did you explain to children that love sometimes meant letting go, that protection could become its own kind of cage, that the world was full of monsters, and sometimes the monsters were the ones who needed saving? "Different changes," she said finally. "Come on, let's go talk to him together." The basement stairs felt steeper than usual as Margaret led her grandchildren down to the chambers where their family's greatest secret waited. Behind her, Josh carried his new wolf book with the reverence of a sacred text, while Emma clutched the latest watercolor she'd painted at school, another family portrait that somehow always included a tall, shadowy figure she'd never consciously seen. Augustus waited in the main chamber's center, standing at his full imposing height instead of settling into his usual corner. In the soft lighting, his lupine features held an almost regal bearing that Margaret had never noticed before. For the first time in 50 years, he looked less like a rescued creature, and more like what he'd been designed to be. Something powerful, something dangerous, something magnificent. "Augustus!" Emma dropped her painting and rushed toward him with absolute trust. "We missed you!" But instead of his usual gentle greeting, Augustus remained motionless, studying the children with an intensity that made Margaret's breath catch. For one terrible moment, she saw him as the agents must see him, 7 feet of muscle and fang and unnatural intelligence, created in laboratories for purposes that had nothing to do with bedtime stories and watercolor paintings. Then Josh stepped forward, his young face serious with concern. "You look sad," he said simply. "Are you worried about something?" The careful facade Augustus had maintained throughout dinner crumbled. He sank to his knees, bringing himself closer to the children's eye level, and Margaret saw tears tracking down his lupine features. "I am worried," he said in his careful, measured voice, "because sometimes, when you love someone very much, you have to do things that might hurt them to keep them safe." Emma reached out and touched his massive paw, her small fingers tracing patterns in his dark fur. "Like when Grandma Maggie gave away my bird when it got better." Margaret remembered. A wounded sparrow they'd nursed back to health last spring. Emma had cried for days when they'd released it, unable to understand that healing meant returning to the wild. "Yes," Augustus said softly. "Exactly like that." Josh, always quicker to grasp adult complexities, studied Augustus with growing understanding. "You have to go somewhere, don't you? Somewhere we can't visit." The simple acceptance in his voice nearly broke Margaret's composure entirely. Her grandchildren possessed that peculiar wisdom of childhood, the ability to recognize truth even when they didn't fully comprehend its implications. Augustus nodded slowly. "There are others like me who are lost and dangerous. People are getting hurt, and I might be the only one who can help find them and make them stop. Will you come back?" Emma's voice was very small. Augustus looked at Margaret, and in his golden eyes she saw the weight of a promise neither of them could make. Outside, the storm raged against windows that had protected their secret for half a century, while federal agents waited in the darkness for a creature who had just chosen to sacrifice everything for the sake of strangers he'd never meet. "I don't know," Augustus said, "but I'll try." The words hung in the basement air like a death sentence. Emma's small hand stilled against Augustus's paw, her 6-year-old mind working to process concepts that had no place in her understanding of the world. Josh stood frozen, the wolf book clutched against his chest like armor that might protect him from the truth. Margaret watched her family fracture in real time, 50 years of careful protection crumbling in the space between one heartbeat and the next. This was her greatest fear made manifest, not the government agents or their demands, not even the monsters loose in the wilderness, but this moment when love collided with necessity and shattered everything she'd built. "How long?" Josh's voice cracked on the words, betraying the 8-year-old boy beneath his serious exterior. Augustus's ears flattened against his skull, a gesture of distress Margaret had seen only once before, the night Robert died, and she'd had to explain that their protector wouldn't be coming home. "Tonight," he said quietly, "after you're asleep." Emma's face crumpled. "But we just got here. We brought you stories and Emma made you a new picture." Her voice rose to the desperate pitch of childhood injustice, the sound that preceded the kind of tears that couldn't be consoled with ice cream or promises. Margaret knelt beside her granddaughter, her own hands trembling as she reached for the small shoulders that shook with building sobs. For 50 years, she'd imagined this moment differently. A gradual revelation, perhaps when the children were older, a choice made in safety, with time for proper goodbyes and careful explanations. Not this. Never this desperate scramble to maintain dignity while her world collapsed. "Emma, sweetheart," she began, but Augustus's voice cut through her attempt at comfort. "I need to tell you something important," he said, his golden eyes fixed on both children with laser intensity. "Do you remember the stories your grandmother read about brave knights? How they had to leave their castles to fight dragons?" Josh nodded slowly, his scientific mind already working to categorize this new information. "But those are just stories." "Are they?" Augustus shifted, settling more comfortably on the floor so the children could come closer without feeling overwhelmed by his size. "What if I told you that sometimes monsters are real, but so are the ones who fight them?" Margaret felt her breath catch. This wasn't the gentle revelation she'd planned. Augustus was pushing toward dangerous territory, toward truths that could shatter more than just a weekend routine. Emma wiped her nose on her sleeve, her tears momentarily forgotten in favor of curiosity. "You mean like real monsters? Not just in books?" "Real monsters," Augustus confirmed. "But here's the secret, the really important secret that you have to promise to remember always. Sometimes the things that look like monsters aren't the ones you need to be afraid of, and sometimes the ones who look normal are the most dangerous of all." Margaret understood what he was doing, trying to prepare them for a world where their beloved family dog might become the subject of news reports, where their childhood sanctuary might be invaded by questions they couldn't answer. But the risk terrified her. Children's secrets had a way of spilling out at the worst possible moments. "The people upstairs," Josh said suddenly, his voice sharp with realization. "The ones in the cars we saw when Mom dropped us off. They're here for you, aren't they?" Margaret's heart lurched. She'd hoped the children hadn't noticed the subtle surveillance, the black SUVs positioned just within sight of the property. But Josh missed nothing. filed away every detail like evidence in some grand conspiracy he was slowly unraveling. "Yes," Augustus said simply. "They need my help to stop something very bad. But you've never even been outside." Emma's protest carried the weight of absolute certainty. How can you help with anything when you live in the basement? The question cut deeper than any scalpel Margaret had ever wielded. In her granddaughter's innocent logic lay the full scope of what they'd done, protected Augustus so completely that he'd become a prisoner of their love, sheltered to the point of helplessness. Except Augustus wasn't helpless. Margaret could see it now in the way he held himself, the new tension in his posture that spoke of readiness rather than resignation. 50 years of indoor life hadn't made him weak. It had given him something his creators never intended: purpose beyond survival, love worth protecting. A moral compass calibrated not by violence, but by the sound of children's laughter drifting through basement walls. "That's exactly why I can help," Augustus said, his voice gaining strength. "Because I know what it's like to be different, to be afraid, to want things you can't have. The monsters out there, they're lost. They're doing terrible things because no one ever taught them how to be anything else." Margaret felt the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. This wasn't just about tracking and stopping the escaped creatures. Augustus wasn't being recruited as a hunter. He was being asked to be a translator between two worlds that had forgotten how to speak to each other. The stakes weren't just life and death anymore. They were about the possibility of redemption in a world that had given up on monsters learning to be anything else. Margaret watched the hope bloom in her grandchildren's eyes and felt her heart shatter. Emma had stopped crying, her 6-year-old mind latching onto the possibility that Augustus could somehow fix everything and come home. Josh nodded with the grave acceptance of someone who believed in heroes, in stories where the brave always found their way back to the people who loved them. They didn't understand. How could they? They'd never seen what Margaret had seen in those classified files, the other subjects, the ones who'd been deemed failures before the program shut down. They didn't know that Augustus was walking into something designed to kill creatures exactly like him, armed with nothing but 50 years of bedtime stories and a faith in goodness that the world had already tried to destroy once. "Will you send us letters?" Emma asked, climbing onto Augustus's lap with the unconscious trust of someone who'd never known monsters to be anything but gentle. "Like when Daddy goes on business trips." Augustus's arms encircled her automatically, but Margaret caught the way his hands trembled. "I'll try," he said, the words barely above a whisper. "You promise to be careful?" Josh pressed, his 8-year-old seriousness making him sound decades older. "You promise to come back when you're done helping?" And there it was, the moment Margaret had dreaded more than government raids or escaped creatures. The moment when Augustus would have to choose between offering false comfort and destroying what little peace these children had left. "I promise," Augustus said, "to do everything I can." It wasn't the promise they wanted. Margaret could see Josh's face tighten as he parsed the careful phrasing, the escape clauses built into words meant to sound reassuring. But Emma smiled and snuggled closer, satisfied with what sounded like certainty to her young ears. Margaret's phone buzzed. Agent Chen probably growing impatient with their extended goodbye. The reminder of the world waiting upstairs hit her like a physical blow. The agents with their weapons and their helicopters and their absolute certainty that Augustus was more weapon than family member. They'd give him tactical gear and mission briefings, treat him like the experimental subject he'd been designed to be, rather than the gentle soul he'd chosen to become. "Grandma Maggie?" Emma's voice pulled her back to the basement, to the impossible choice that was about to tear her family apart. "Will you take care of Augustus's room while he's gone? Keep his books safe?" The question was so innocent, so practical, that Margaret nearly broke down entirely. Emma thought this was temporary. She was already planning for Augustus's return, probably imagining the stories they'd share about his adventure, the drawings she'd make of his heroic journey. "Of course, sweetheart," Margaret managed. "Everything will be exactly as he left it." Another lie. Another small betrayal stacked on top of 50 years of necessary deceptions, because the truth was that Margaret didn't know if there would be anything left to preserve. The agents had made no promises about Augustus's survival, offered no guarantees beyond the cold mathematics of stopping a threat. One experimental subject deployed to neutralize another, with acceptable losses built into their calculations. Augustus caught her eye over Emma's head, and she saw her own terror reflected in his golden gaze. He was as frightened as she was, as unprepared for the world beyond these walls as any creature raised in captivity. But unlike her, he'd made his peace with the necessity of it. He'd chosen sacrifice over safety, purpose over protection. The floorboards above them creaked, Agent Chen growing tired of waiting, probably. Margaret's phone buzzed again, then again. Emma looked up at the sound, her face clouding with the realization that their time was running out. "I don't want you to go," she said, her voice small and broken. "I don't want anything to change." Augustus pressed his muzzle against her hair, breathing in the scent of childhood innocence that would soon be just a memory. "Change isn't always bad," he said. "Sometimes it's the only way to protect the things that matter most." But even as he spoke the words, Margaret could hear the doubt beneath them. Augustus was trying to convince himself as much as the children, building courage from conviction that felt increasingly fragile. He was walking into darkness armed with nothing but love, facing creatures that had been shaped by violence and abandonment, instead of bedtime stories and gentle hands. Above them, footsteps crossed the kitchen floor. Heavy boots, not Margaret's daughter's familiar step. The agents were inside now, waiting in her sanctuary, turning her home into a staging ground for horrors she could barely comprehend. Margaret looked at her grandchildren, Emma curled against Augustus's chest, Josh standing sentinel with his wolf book clutched like a talisman, and realized that this was the last moment of before. In minutes they'd go upstairs to a world where federal agents waited in the kitchen, and their beloved family secret would disappear into a night that might never end. Everything she'd built, everything she'd protected, everything she'd sacrificed 50 years to preserve, all of it was ending tonight. And there was nothing left to do but help the people she loved most learn how to say goodbye. Margaret stood at the foot of the basement stairs, one trembling hand on the wooden banister that had guided 3 generations of her family into Augustus's sanctuary. Behind her, Emma's muffled sobs echoed off concrete walls, while Josh whispered fierce promises that he'd take care of his little sister until Augustus came home. The lies they were all telling themselves felt heavier than the storm raging outside. But as Margaret climbed toward the kitchen, where federal agents waited with their tactical gear and classified briefings, something crystallized in her mind with devastating clarity. The careful story she'd built around Augustus, rescued creature, government experiment gone wrong, abandoned subject, was crumbling under the weight of what she'd just witnessed. The way Augustus had spoken to the children, not like a damaged victim seeking comfort, but like a protector preparing for war. The way he'd held himself when he thought no one was watching, not with the careful posture of something trying to appear human, but with the natural authority of something that had always been more than human. The way Agent Chen's voice had carried respect rather than the clinical detachment reserved for experimental subjects. Margaret's hand stilled on the kitchen door. 50 years of assumptions crashed together in her mind like puzzle pieces, finally finding their proper configuration. Augustus hadn't been abandoned by the program. He hadn't been discarded as a failure or forgotten in bureaucratic chaos. He'd been placed with her. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, her mentor, the woman who'd supposedly died in that laboratory fire. She hadn't been trying to hide Augustus from the government. She'd been working with them. The veterinary school recommendation, the job placement in the most isolated corner of Washington, the house that came with its unusually spacious basement and soundproof walls. Margaret's mind raced through decades of careful memories, reframing every detail through this new lens. The way government funding for her clinic had always materialized without explanation. The medical supplies that arrived without invoices. The protective perimeter she'd assumed was her own paranoia, but now recognized as something far more sophisticated. She'd never been Augustus's savior. She'd been his handler. The kitchen door swung open before she could push it, revealing Agent Chen's sharp features etched with something that might have been sympathy. Behind him, the familiar warmth of Margaret's kitchen had been transformed into a command center. Laptops, communication equipment, tactical maps spread across the table where she'd fed 3 generations of grandchildren. "Dr. Thorne," Chen said quietly, "I think it's time we discussed what you really know about Subject 7. Subject 7. Not Augustus, never Augustus in their files." Margaret felt the last of her illusions collapse as she understood that she'd never been protecting a secret from the government. She'd been protecting it for them. How long? Her voice came out as a whisper. "How long have you been watching?" "Since 1973. Agent Patterson answered from her position near the window. "Your mentor, Dr. Reeves, identified you as the ideal candidate. Young enough to adapt, skilled enough to provide proper care, isolated enough to maintain security, and most importantly, compassionate enough to give 7 what we couldn't." Margaret sank into her kitchen chair, the same one where she'd drunk coffee every morning for 50 years while Augustus listened to her read the newspaper through the basement ceiling. "You made me love him." "We gave you the opportunity to love him," Chen corrected, his voice gentler than she'd expected. "What you built together, that was real. But it was always temporary. 7 was always meant for this." The pieces kept falling into place with horrible precision. Augustus's unusual intelligence, his emotional sophistication, his ability to understand complex moral concepts, those hadn't been happy accidents of good parenting. They'd been the intended outcomes of a 50-year experiment in creating something unprecedented, a weapon capable of mercy. "The others," Margaret said, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "The escaped subjects. They weren't raised like Augustus." "No," Patterson confirmed. "They were trained through traditional methods, conditioning, punishment, isolation. They know only how to hunt and kill. 7 knows how to choose." Margaret thought of Emma's watercolor paintings, of Josh's serious questions about animal behavior, of bedtime stories read through basement walls. Every moment of love, every act of kindness, every lesson in humanity, all of it had been preparing Augustus for this night. Not despite the government's plans, but because of them. "You used my family," she breathed. "My grandchildren. You used their innocence to teach him." "To teach him what we could never teach him in a laboratory," Chen interrupted. "What love looks like, what's worth protecting, what it means to choose sacrifice over survival." Above the kitchen table, rain lashed against windows that had witnessed 50 years of careful lies. Margaret stared at her hands, the same hands that had tended Augustus's injuries, administered his medications, taught him to be gentle with creatures smaller than himself. Every tremor in her fingers told the story of a woman who'd built her life around protecting something that had never needed her protection. She'd been the experiment, too. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, broken only by the storm's relentless assault on the windows. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, not the familiar weight of guilt she'd carried for decades, but something harder, more purposeful. The tremor in her hands stilled for the first time in months. 50 years, she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. 50 years of thinking I was protecting him from you, when I was actually preparing him for you." She looked up at Chen, and he must have seen something in her expression that made him step back slightly. "But here's what you didn't count on, what you couldn't have planned for." She stood slowly, her arthritic joints protesting, but her spine straightening with newfound resolve. "I may have been your unwitting handler, Agent Chen, but Augustus became my family, and that changes everything." Patterson moved closer to the window, one hand resting casually near her weapon. "Dr. Thorne, I understand you're upset, but the mission parameters—" "The mission parameters assume you're dealing with a weapon," Margaret interrupted, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "You're not. You're dealing with someone who learned to be human, because children read him bedtime stories. Someone who knows the difference between protecting and destroying because he spent 50 years learning that difference through love, not programming." Chen exchanged a glance with Patterson. Your point being? My point is that if you want Augustus to succeed, if you want him to reach those other subjects instead of simply killing them, you need to understand what actually motivates him. And it's not duty or training or whatever psychological conditioning you think shaped him. Margaret moved to the kitchen sink, her hands gripping the familiar porcelain edge as she stared out into the storm. In the reflection of the rain-streaked glass, she could see her own face, weathered, determined, no longer the naive young veterinarian who'd been chosen for her compassion. He'll do this mission, she continued, because he believes in protecting innocence. Because Emma and Josh taught him that some things are worth any sacrifice. But if you send him out there thinking like government agents instead of thinking like family, you'll lose him. And you'll lose any chance of saving those other subjects too. She turned back to face them, and for the first time since the agents had arrived, she felt like she was standing on solid ground. You want Augustus to succeed? Then you listen to what I know about him. 50 years of daily observation. 50 years of understanding how his mind works, what frightens him, what gives him strength. Chen's laptop chimed softly, breaking the tension. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. Dr. Thorne, I appreciate your insights, but we have reports of another incident, 40 miles east. Time is a factor. Then stop wasting it, Margaret snapped, her grandmother's protective instincts fully engaged now. Sit down and let me tell you how to keep Augustus alive long enough to matter. For a moment, she thought Chen might refuse. The federal agent in him clearly bristled at taking orders from a small-town veterinarian. But something in Margaret's bearing, the absolute certainty of someone who'd spent half a century learning to read the subtle signs of a creature everyone else thought was unknowable, made him pause. What do you need from us? He asked finally. Margaret felt a fierce satisfaction surge through her. This was what she'd been trained for, even if she hadn't known it. Not just to care for Augustus, but to advocate for him when the time came, to translate between the world that saw him as a weapon and the truth of what he'd become. First, communication equipment that reaches here, she said, her mind already racing through possibilities. Augustus will need to know he has a safe harbor to return to. That Emma and Josh are protected. Fear for our safety will compromise his judgment. Patterson was taking notes now, her earlier skepticism replaced by professional attention. What else? Medical supplies, Margaret continued, warming to the task. Not just for him, for the others. Augustus won't be able to help subjects that see him as a threat if he approaches them like a hunter. But if he can tend to their injuries, show them care instead of violence. She paused, the full scope of the possibility hitting her. You're not just sending him to stop them, you're sending him to save them. Chen nodded slowly. The goal has always been recovery when possible. Elimination only as a last resort. Then you need to understand something crucial about Augustus, Margaret said, moving back to the table where classified files lay scattered across the surface where she'd served countless family dinners. He doesn't just know how to choose mercy over violence. He's incapable of abandoning hope for redemption, even when he should. She looked down at the tactical maps, the mission parameters, the cold military planning that would determine whether Augustus lived or died in the coming hours. Then she began reorganizing them with the decisive movements of someone who finally understood her true purpose. Now, she said, let me teach you how to plan a mission for someone who fights with love instead of hate. The transformation of Margaret's kitchen into a war room took less than 20 minutes, but it felt like watching 50 years of carefully maintained normalcy dissolve in real time. Chen's team worked with efficient precision, replacing her salt and pepper shakers with encrypted radios, spreading topographical maps where Emma's school artwork usually lay drying, installing communication arrays that turned her breakfast nook into a command center. But Margaret found herself oddly calm as she watched her sanctuary become something unrecognizable. The tremor in her hands had disappeared entirely, replaced by the steady certainty of someone who finally understood their role in a story much larger than they'd imagined. She wasn't just Augustus's caretaker anymore. She was his tactical advisor, his psychological profile expert, his link to humanity, in a mission designed by people who understood warfare but not love. "The approach vectors are wrong," she said, leaning over the map that showed the last known positions of the escaped subjects. Her finger traced the dense forest paths she'd walked countless times with Augustus during his carefully supervised exercise periods. "You're thinking like hunters tracking prey. But Augustus doesn't hunt, he explores. He investigates. He tries to understand before he acts." Agent Torres, the tactical specialist who'd arrived with the second wave of personnel, frowned at her corrections. "Dr. Thorne, with respect, these are optimal engagement strategies based on terrain analysis and subject movement patterns. Based on data from subjects who were raised in laboratories," Margaret interrupted, surprising herself with her authoritative tone. "Augustus was raised in a home. He understands territory differently. He doesn't think in terms of ambush points and kill zones. He thinks in terms of safe spaces and vulnerable creatures that might need help." She pointed to a cluster of caves marked as potential hiding spots for the escapees. "You see tactical advantage in elevated positions with limited approach routes. Augustus will see injured animals seeking shelter. His first instinct won't be to corner them. It'll be to offer comfort." Chen looked up from his laptop where incident reports continued streaming in. "That could get him killed." "Yes," Margaret said simply. "It could. But it's also the only thing that might get him close enough to those subjects to actually help them, instead of just eliminating them. The question is whether you trust 50 years of his training enough to let him try his way first." The room fell silent except for the steady patter of rain against windows and the electronic chatter of incoming communications. Margaret could feel the weight of their assessment, these federal agents trying to reconcile their understanding of experimental subjects with her description of someone who worried about Emma's nightmares and helped Josh with his science homework. Patterson moved to the map, studying Margaret's suggested modifications with growing interest. "You're saying his empathy could be a tactical advantage rather than a liability?" "I'm saying it's the only advantage that matters," Margaret replied. "Those other subjects, they've never experienced kindness from anything stronger than themselves. They don't know what mercy looks like. But Augustus does. He could show them something they've never seen before." She thought of all the times Augustus had tended to injured wildlife, his massive hands gentle enough to splint a bird's broken wing or clean infection from a wounded raccoon's cuts. The careful way he'd learned to modulate his voice around the children, making himself smaller and less threatening when their emotions ran high. "You bred killers," Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength. "But you raised one guardian. The difference might be everything." Chen's radio crackled with an urgent transmission. "Control. This is Falcon 2. We've got eyes on possible subject 4, approximately 30 miles northeast of base position. Civilian vehicle disabled on Highway 101. Single adult male appears injured." Margaret's blood went cold. Highway 101 ran past 3 different campgrounds, 2 rural schools, and countless isolated homes. "How many people in the area?" "Unknown," came the response. "Storms got half the county without power. Could be dozens of families sheltering in place." The scope of potential casualties hit the room like a physical force. Margaret watched Chen and Patterson exchange grim looks, saw Torres begin calculating response times and asset deployment. They were already thinking in terms of acceptable losses, weighing the lives of strangers against the strategic value of their mission. But Margaret was thinking of Emma's drawings, of Josh's careful questions about animal behavior, of bedtime stories read through basement walls. She was thinking of all the ways Augustus had learned to see individual worth instead of statistical probabilities. "We need to move now," she said, reaching for her coat with steady hands. "Augustus needs to see this through my eyes, not yours. He needs to understand that every person in those hills is someone's grandchild." Chen stood, blocking her path to the door. "Dr. Thorne, you're not field personnel. This is a combat situation." Margaret looked at him with 50 years of fierce protective instincts blazing in her eyes. "Agent Chen, I've been in a combat situation my entire adult life. I just didn't know I was fighting for the soul of something you created, but never understood." She pushed past him toward the basement door, where Augustus waited with 2 frightened children and the weight of impossible choices. The final confrontation was coming whether they were ready or not, and Margaret Thorne was done pretending she wasn't a soldier in this war. The basement felt different as Margaret descended the familiar wooden steps, each creak now carrying the weight of revealed truths. The sound of her footsteps seemed amplified in the space that had been Augustus's sanctuary for 5 decades, where government surveillance had masqueraded as grandmother's love, where every bedtime story had been an unwitting lesson in humanity. She found him exactly where she'd left him, positioned between Emma and Josh like a living shield, his massive frame somehow managing to appear both protective and gentle in the dim light. The children had fallen asleep against his sides, Emma's small hand still clutching one of her drawings, Josh's head pillowed on Augustus's forearm. For a moment, Margaret's resolve wavered as she looked at this tableau of innocence that had been orchestrated by forces none of them had understood. But then Augustus's eyes met hers, and she saw something that made her breath catch. Not the confusion or fear she'd expected, but a profound sadness mixed with what could only be described as relief, as if he'd been waiting his entire life for this moment of truth. "You heard," she said quietly, settling onto the familiar stool where she'd spent countless hours reading to him through the years. Augustus nodded slowly, his enhanced hearing having undoubtedly caught every word of the conversation upstairs. "The walls," he said in his careful, measured voice, "were never really soundproof, were they?" Margaret felt her heart break a little more. "No, they weren't. And you knew." It wasn't a question. His dark eyes searched her face with an intelligence that had nothing to do with government experimentation and everything to do with 50 years of learning to read the subtle expressions of someone he loved. "Not until tonight," she whispered. "Augustus, I swear to you, I thought I was protecting you from them. You thought you were saving me." His voice held no accusation, only the gentle understanding that had always been his greatest gift and most dangerous weapon. "You were. Just not the way either of us believed." Emma stirred in her sleep, mumbling something about feeding the birds, and Augustus's hand moved instinctively to smooth her hair with a tenderness that belied every government file upstairs. Margaret watched the gesture and felt something crystallize in her chest, a fierce certainty that transcended 50 years of manipulation and lies. "They want to send you after the others," she said. "Tonight. There's been another incident." Augustus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between the sleeping children and the woman who'd shaped his understanding of love, sacrifice, and moral choice. "People are in danger. Yes, and I'm the only one who might be able to reach the others, to help them instead of just stopping them." Margaret nodded, watching him process the weight of what was being asked. Not just to risk his life, but to leave the only family he'd ever known to face creatures who would see him as either threat or rival, to choose between the safety of these walls and the lives of strangers he'd never met. "Will you stay with them?" he asked, his meaning clear. "Not just tonight, but whatever came after." "Always," Margaret promised, the word carrying 5 decades of unbreakable commitment. "But Augustus, you need to understand something before you make this choice. What you learned here, what we built together, that's real. The love, the lessons, the way Emma and Josh see you as family, none of that was programmed or planned or artificial. That's who you became despite their intentions, not because of them." She reached out, her weathered hand covering his massive one. "You don't owe them anything, not the government, not their mission, not their experiment. Whatever you choose to do tonight, you do it because of who you are, not what they made you to be." Augustus looked down at their joined hands, the veterinarian's fingers that had tended his wounds and the claws that had learned to be gentle through her teaching. Above them, footsteps moved urgently across the kitchen floor as agents prepared for deployment, but here in the basement sanctuary, time seemed suspended. "I know," he said finally, "but that's exactly why I have to go." Margaret felt tears she'd been holding back for hours finally spill over, because she understood. The government had tried to create a weapon capable of strategic mercy, but what they'd actually created was something far more powerful and dangerous, a being capable of unconditional love who understood that love sometimes demanded impossible sacrifice. "Then we do this right," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "Not their way, our way. Family protecting family, even when family includes strangers we've never met." She stood, her movements decisive. "But first, there's something upstairs you need to see. Something that will help you understand what you're really walking into." As they prepared to wake the children and climb the stairs toward a confrontation 50 years in the making, Margaret felt the last of her tremors fade away. The final test wasn't just beginning for Augustus, it was beginning for all of them. And for the first time since the black SUVs had arrived, she was certain they were ready. The kitchen had been transformed into something from Margaret's darkest nightmares. Banks of monitors casting blue light across tactical maps, agents speaking in clipped military phrases, the familiar warmth of her home replaced by the cold efficiency of a war room. But it was the figure standing in the center of it all that made her breath catch. Augustus rose from the basement stairs like something out of legend, his 7-foot frame filling the doorway as Emma and Josh flanked him on either side. In the harsh LED lighting, every aspect of his lupine features was starkly visible: the pronounced canines, the golden eyes that reflected light like a nocturnal predator's, the powerful musculature that spoke of capabilities far beyond human limits. The federal agents instinctively stepped back, hands moving toward concealed weapons with practiced efficiency. But Margaret saw only her family's guardian, noting how Augustus kept his massive hands visible and non-threatening, how he'd positioned himself to shield the children from the agent's direct line of sight, how his voice when he spoke was carefully modulated to sound as human as possible. Dr. Thorne said, "There was something I needed to see." Agent Chen recovered first, his professional composure reasserting itself as he gestured toward the largest monitor. "Subject profiles of the escapees, what we're dealing with." The screen flickered to life, displaying a series of photographs and data readouts that made Margaret's stomach clench. Unlike the careful documentation of Augustus's development over 50 years, these were clinical shots of creatures that looked more like weaponized nightmares than anything resembling family pets. Subject 2 bore similarities to Augustus, but with pronounced differences: larger, more angular, with scars that spoke of surgical modifications and behavioral conditioning. The others were progressively more disturbing, each iteration pushing further from anything that could be mistaken for natural evolution. "They were the prototypes," Patterson explained, her voice carefully neutral. "Before the program understood the importance of early socialization and environmental factors." Augustus studied the images with an expression Margaret had never seen before, a mixture of profound sadness and recognition that transcended mere physical similarities. "They're in pain," he said quietly. "All of them. I can see it in their posture, their eyes." Josh moved closer to Augustus, his young face pale but determined. "They look scared." "Yes," Augustus confirmed, his voice gentle despite the gravity of the moment. "Very scared. And when intelligent creatures are scared and in pain for too long, they sometimes forget how to trust anything except their own survival instincts." Chen pulled up a tactical display showing current positions and incident reports. 3 confirmed kills so far. 2 hikers, 1 park ranger. Subject 4 disabled a family's vehicle on Highway 101 approximately 40 minutes ago. We've lost contact with our advance team. The weight of those words settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Margaret watched Augustus process the information, saw the moment when abstract mission parameters became personal stakes. People were dying while they stood here talking. "You want me to hunt them?" Augustus said, his tone making it a statement rather than a question. "We want you to stop them," Chen corrected, "by whatever means necessary." Emma tugged on Augustus's sleeve, her child's voice cutting through the tactical discussion with devastating clarity. "Will they hurt you?" The question hung in the air, like a challenge to everything the federal agents thought they understood about their mission. Margaret watched Augustus kneel down to Emma's level, bringing his intimidating frame into the child's comfort zone with practiced ease. "They might try," he said honestly, "but I'm going to try to help them first. Sometimes when anyone, is hurt and scared for a long time, they forget that not everyone is dangerous. They forget that some people want to help. Torres stepped forward, impatience evident in his bearing. Subject 7. We need to move. Every minute we delay means more potential casualties. But Augustus didn't rise. Instead, he looked directly at Margaret, with an expression that conveyed volumes of unspoken communication. In his eyes, she saw the child who'd once trembled at thunderstorms, the adolescent who'd learned to read by following her finger across picture books, the adult who'd spent decades mastering the delicate art of being gentle despite his overwhelming physical capabilities. She also saw her own reflection in those golden depths, not the naive young veterinarian who'd been chosen for her compassion, but the woman who'd spent 50 years learning to advocate for someone the world would never fully understand. Go, she said, her voice steady and sure. Show them what family looks like. Augustus rose, and for the first time since the agents had arrived, Margaret saw him fully embrace what he was. Not the government's creation or her surrogate grandchild, but something entirely new. Something that chose love over survival, protection over self-preservation. The storm outside had reached its peak intensity, and as Augustus moved toward the door, Margaret realized that the weather was the least dangerous thing waiting for him in the Olympic Peninsula's unforgiving wilderness. The door closed behind Augustus with a finality that seemed to echo through Margaret's bones. She stood at the kitchen window, watching his massive silhouette disappear into the storm-lashed darkness, and felt something inside her chest tear open, not breaking, but deliberately cutting away a piece of herself that she would never get back. "Grandma?" Emma's voice was small, uncertain. "When is Augustus coming home?" The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. When, not if. The beautiful, terrible faith of children who believed that love was armor enough against anything the world could offer. Margaret knelt beside her granddaughter, gathering both children close as she faced the probability she couldn't voice, that Augustus might not survive what waited for him in those fog-shrouded hills. "I don't know, sweetheart," she whispered, the words scraping her throat raw, "but he's going to try very hard to come back to us." Chen's radio crackled with updates, coordinates, movement patterns, the clinical language of a hunt disguised as a rescue operation. Margaret listened with growing dread as the reports painted a picture of Augustus moving deeper into terrain where every shadow could hide something that saw him as either rival or prey. "Contact with Subject 7 confirmed," came the static-laden voice. "Proceeding toward last known position of Subject 4. Margaret closed her eyes, trying not to imagine Augustus alone in the wilderness that had been his prison and protection for 50 years. Out there, he wasn't her gentle giant who read bedtime stories and worried about thunderstorms. He was Subject 7, a government asset deployed against creatures that shared his engineered strength, but none of his learned compassion. "Dr. Thorne." Patterson's voice was softer than Margaret had heard it all evening. "He's not going in unprepared. We've equipped him with communication gear, tracking devices." "You've sent him to save monsters that were tortured into madness," Margaret interrupted, her voice sharp with 5 decades of suppressed fury. "With what? Good intentions and a radio?" The agents exchanged glances, and Margaret saw the truth they'd been carefully avoiding. This wasn't a rescue mission, it was a field test. They were using Augustus's compassion as a weapon against creatures they'd given up trying to contain, betting his capacity for mercy against their capacity for violence. If he succeeded in reaching the other subjects, they'd study the results. If he died trying, they'd at least have eliminated the most dangerous variables from their equation. Josh pulled away from her embrace, his young face set with determination that reminded her painfully of his grandfather. "We should help him. Honey, we can't." "Yes, we can." Josh's voice carried a conviction that silenced the room. Augustus always said family protects family. He's protecting everyone out there. We should protect him. Margaret felt her heart break and mend simultaneously. This 10-year-old boy had grasped something the federal agents with their tactical expertise and classified protocols had missed entirely. That love was a choice that demanded reciprocity. That protection was a covenant that ran both ways. "How?" she asked. her voice barely audible. Josh pointed to the monitors still displaying topographical data and incident reports. You know him better than anyone. You know how he thinks, what he'll do. You can help them find him faster, help him get home. The simple logic of it staggered her. For 50 years, Margaret had been Augustus's interpreter to a world that would never fully understand him. She knew his patterns, his instincts, the way his engineered physiology interacted with his learned behaviors. She could predict his choices in ways that no tactical analysis could match. But helping meant collaborating with the very system that had manipulated them both for decades. It meant becoming complicit in using Augustus's compassion as a strategic asset. Margaret looked at Emma, still clutching her drawings of their unconventional family. At Josh, whose faith in the power of love to overcome institutional indifference shamed her own cynicism. At the monitors showing Augustus moving deeper into danger with every passing minute. "Show me the real-time feeds," she said, her voice steady with newfound purpose. Chen hesitated. "Dr. Thorne, this is classified." "That's my grandson out there," Margaret said, using the word deliberately, claiming it fully for the first time. "Either you let me help bring him home, or you explain to these children why you chose protocol over family." The room went silent except for the storm battering the windows and the electronic chatter of ongoing operations. Margaret felt the weight of their assessment, but she also felt something else, the absolute certainty that came from 50 years of fierce, protective love. Patterson moved to the communications console, making space for Margaret beside the monitors. "Tell us what he's thinking." Margaret settled into the chair and began the work of guiding Augustus home through the most dangerous night of their shared lives, knowing that every choice she made might be the difference between rescue and loss, between family preserved and family shattered forever. The real-time feeds painted a brutal picture across the monitors, heat signatures moving through the forest canopy, infrared blooms that spoke of violence in the darkness. Margaret's hands moved across the console with surgeon's precision, her 50 years of reading Augustus's behavioral patterns translating into tactical guidance she'd never imagined herself capable of providing. "He's circling," she told the assembled agents, watching the GPS tracker trace a careful arc through terrain she recognized from decades of walks with the children. "See this pattern? He's not approaching directly. He's listening, trying to understand what happened before he engages." Chen leaned over her shoulder, studying the display. Subject 4's last known position was here, approximately 800 meters north. Our advance team went silent 43 minutes ago. Margaret's stomach clenched, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "Augustus won't rush in, not if he thinks there are bodies. He'll need to process what he's seeing, what it means about the mental state of whoever did this." The radio crackled suddenly, and Augustus's voice filled the kitchen, distorted by static and distance, but unmistakably alive. "Control, this is 7. I've found your team." The words carried weight that had nothing to do with their tactical significance. Margaret heard the careful control in Augustus's voice, the way he was managing his emotional response to whatever scene lay before him. She'd heard that same tone when he'd found injured animals in the forest, when he'd had to explain death to the children for the first time. "Report," Patterson commanded. "They're alive, unconscious but breathing. Looks like they were herded." Moved away from the main confrontation site and left where they'd be found. Augustus paused, and Margaret could practically see him analyzing scent trails and environmental evidence, with senses far keener than any human possessed. "Control. I don't think Subject 4 intended to kill them." The agents exchanged glances loaded with implications Margaret didn't want to consider. Emma pressed closer to her side, her small hand gripping Margaret's arm with fierce determination. "That's good, right, Grandma? That means they're not as scary as everyone thought." Margaret's throat tightened. From the mouths of babes, Emma had grasped what the federal agents were still struggling to accept. The escaped subjects weren't mindless killing machines. They were damaged beings acting out of desperation and trauma, capable of choices that suggested intelligence and even restraint. "Augustus is moving again," Torres reported, tracking the GPS signal across the topographical display. Heading northwest toward the river drainage. Margaret studied the terrain features with practiced eyes, seeing not just tactical advantages, but a landscape of memory. That's where we used to go for Emma's nature walks. There are caves in that area, natural shelters. If Subject 4 is injured or trying to establish territory. He's following the scent trail, came Augustus's voice again, tighter now with concentration. Control, I need you to understand something. Whoever I'm tracking, they're afraid. The pheromone markers, the movement patterns, this isn't aggression, it's panic. Chen's jaw tightened. Panic that's resulted in multiple casualties. Yes, Augustus acknowledged, his voice carrying a weight of sadness that spoke to his complete understanding of the stakes involved, but panic that might respond to the right approach. Give me room to try communication before containment. Margaret felt her hands begin to tremble again, not from nerve damage this time, but from the crushing realization of what Augustus was attempting. He was betting his life on the possibility that 50 years of learned compassion could reach across an unbridgeable gap of trauma and conditioning. That love could speak to creatures who'd been taught to trust nothing except their own capacity for violence. Negative, Chen responded immediately. Your primary objective is containment. Communication is secondary. No. The word came out of Margaret's mouth before she could stop it, carrying 50 years of accumulated fury and protective instinct. Every head in the room turned toward her, but she kept her eyes fixed on the radio, speaking directly to Augustus across the storm-lashed miles. You do this your way, the way we taught you, the way Emma and Josh would want you to. Josh stepped forward, his young voice cutting through the tactical chatter with devastating clarity. Augustus, remember what you always tell us about hurt animals. You have to be patient. You have to show them you're safe before you can help them feel better. The radio was quiet for a long moment. Then Augustus's voice returned, warmer despite the distance and danger. I remember, Josh. I'm going to try. Margaret watched the GPS tracker slow its forward movement as Augustus shifted into the careful, patient approach he'd learned through decades of coaxing frightened creatures toward healing. In the kitchen that had been transformed into a command center, she felt something fundamental shift, not just in the mission parameters, but in her own understanding of what this night had always been building toward. The federal government had tried to use Augustus as a weapon. Instead, they were about to discover what 50 years of unconditional love could accomplish when set loose, in a world desperate for examples of chosen mercy. Outside, the storm began to ease, and Margaret dared to hope. The radio fell silent for 17 agonizing minutes. Margaret counted each second on the antique clock that had marked her family's time for 3 generations, its steady rhythm now seeming to mock the uncertainty crackling through the communications equipment. Emma had fallen asleep against her shoulder, exhaustion finally claiming her small body, while Josh maintained his vigil at the monitor display, tracking the motionless GPS signal that represented everything they held dear. When Augustus's voice finally emerged from the static, it carried a quality Margaret had never heard before. Profound exhaustion, mixed with something that sounded almost like wonder. Control, this is 7. Mission accomplished. Both subjects are alive and responsive. We're going to need medical teams, but not tactical units. Repeat, no tactical response required. The kitchen erupted in controlled chaos as agents coordinated extraction protocols and medical support, but Margaret heard none of it. She pressed her face against Emma's sleeping form and wept, 50 years of accumulated terror and protective fury finally finding release in the impossible reality of Augustus coming home. 3 hours later, she stood on her front porch, watching the sun break through the dissipating storm clouds, painting the Olympic Peninsula in shades of gold and forgiveness. The federal vehicles had departed, taking with them their classified equipment and tactical certainty, leaving behind only trampled flower beds and the lingering scent of institutional arrogance. Augustus emerged from the tree line like something from a children's fairy tale, massive and gentle, moving with the careful grace that had always marked his approach to things more fragile than himself. But Margaret saw the changes immediately. His posture carried new weight, not just physical exhaustion, but the deeper burden of having looked into the faces of what he might have become under different circumstances. "Grandma!" Emma exploded from the house, her morning energy obliterating any memory of last night's tears. "Augustus, did you really save the scary ones?" Augustus knelt in the driveway gravel, accepting Emma's fierce embrace with the reverence of someone who understood exactly how precious normal moments had become. "I helped them remember that they weren't alone," he said simply. "Sometimes that's all anyone really needs." Josh approached more cautiously, his 10-year-old wisdom recognizing that the creature who'd left in the storm was not quite the same one who'd returned. "Are you okay?" Margaret saw Augustus consider the question with characteristic honesty, weighing trauma against triumph, loss against love. "I'm different," he admitted. "I learned things about where I came from, about what I was supposed to be, but I also learned something more important." "What?" Emma demanded, pulling back to study his face with the intense curiosity that had always delighted him. "I learned that who you become matters more than what you were made to be. And I was made into family by the best people in the world." Margaret felt her breath catch as Augustus's golden eyes met hers across the sun-drenched yard. In that gaze, she saw acknowledgement of everything they'd shared and survived: the frightened creature she'd chosen to protect, the gentle giant who'd chosen to stay, the family they'd built together against all logic and institutional opposition. But she also saw something new: the quiet pride of someone who'd discovered that love, properly cultivated, could indeed move mountains, or in this case, reach damaged souls that everyone else had written off as irredeemable monsters. "The others?" Margaret asked quietly, needing to know. "Will they be all right?" Augustus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "They're scared, traumatized, but not broken. The government wants to study them, understand what went wrong with their conditioning. But I think Patterson might actually listen if we suggest they need healing more than analysis." Margaret laughed, the sound carrying 50 years of hard-won cynicism. Federal compassion. Who would have thought? "People change," Augustus said, with the simple conviction that had always been his greatest strength. "Even people in black suits carrying classified files. Sometimes they just need someone to show them what's possible." Josh moved to stand beside Margaret, his young hand finding hers with unconscious support. "So we're still family? All of us? Even after everything?" Margaret looked at the children who'd accepted the impossible with perfect grace, at the creature who'd chosen love over survival instincts, at the home that had sheltered their unconventional bonds for decades. She thought about the federal agents who'd arrived expecting to weaponize compassion and instead witnessed its transformative power. "Especially after everything," she said, her voice steady with absolute certainty. Augustus rose, lifting Emma effortlessly to his shoulder, and they walked together toward the house that had always been their sanctuary. Margaret noticed her hands were steady now, the tremor that had marked 50 years of guilty secrets finally quieted. She'd spent 5 decades protecting Augustus from the world, but in the end, he'd protected her right back, showing her that love, courageously lived, could indeed redeem even the darkest origins. Behind them, the Olympic Peninsula stretched away into morning mist and infinite possibility, holding space for all the damaged creatures learning to trust again. The new beginning. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the same kitchen where federal agents had once transformed her sanctuary into a command center, but now it hummed with an entirely different energy. The morning sun streamed through windows she'd finally gotten around to replacing, casting warm light across Emma's latest artwork, a crayon masterpiece depicting what she cheerfully called Augustus's friends living in their new forest home. "Grandma, the pancakes are burning," Josh observed from his position at the table, where he was methodically working through weekend homework with a focused determination that reminded Margaret daily of his grandfather. She turned back to the stove, smiling at her momentary distraction. The tremor in her hands had never fully returned, though sometimes she caught herself flexing her fingers in wonder, still amazed by their steadiness. Dr. Patricia Chen, who now visited as a friend rather than a federal oversight officer, had explained it as the physical manifestation of psychological resolution. Margaret preferred to think of it as her body finally understanding that the long vigil was over. The sound of gentle conversation drifted through the open back door, where Augustus sat on the newly reinforced porch steps with Agent Patterson. Their weekly check-ins had evolved from mandatory debriefings into something resembling friendship, though Margaret still marveled at the sight of the formerly stone-faced federal agent laughing at Augustus's dry observations about governmental efficiency. "Status report," Patterson was saying, but his tone carried warmth rather than official protocol. "Subjects 2 and 4 are adapting well to the sanctuary environment," Augustus replied, his voice carrying the careful cadence he'd developed when discussing his fellow survivors. "Subject 2 has started communicating more. Yesterday, she asked Dr. Chen about the children." Margaret felt her heart clench with familiar protectiveness, but it was tempered now by trust earned through months of careful progress. The government facility, she still couldn't think of it as a sanctuary without mental air quotes, had been designed according to Augustus's specifications, incorporating everything he'd learned about healing in a family that had loved him past his origins. "She's curious about normal," Augustus continued, "about what it means to belong somewhere without earning your place through usefulness." Through the window, Margaret watched Patterson nod with the gravity of someone who'd been fundamentally changed by proximity to impossible grace. The man who'd arrived in black SUVs expecting to deploy weapons had become an advocate for redemption, arguing in classified briefing rooms for budgets that prioritized healing over containment. "And you?" Patterson asked quietly. "How are you handling the expansion of your responsibilities?" Margaret paused in her pancake flipping to listen, recognizing the careful way Patterson had learned to ask about emotional well-being, without triggering Augustus's instinct to minimize his own needs. "It's difficult," Augustus admitted, his honesty as characteristic as his compassion. "Sometimes I look at them and see what I could have become, but then I come home to Josh's terrible jokes and Emma's art projects, and I remember that healing is always possible. Even for creatures like us. Especially for creatures like you," Margaret called through the window, earning a warm chuckle that carried all the way to the kitchen. Emma thundered down the stairs with the controlled chaos of a 7-year-old who'd been promised pancakes, her hair still wild from sleep, and her arms full of stuffed animals requiring breakfast. She'd processed the revelations about Augustus and his past with the magnificent adaptability of childhood, accepting expanded definitions of family, with the same ease she'd once accepted explanations about why some animals needed special care. "Is Uncle Marcus coming today?" she asked, using the name she'd assigned to Patterson despite his protests that federal agents didn't typically acquire honorary family status. "This afternoon," Margaret confirmed, watching Emma's face light up. Patterson's transformation from threatening authority figure to beloved family friend had been perhaps the most surprising development in 6 months of continuous surprises. "He's bringing pictures of the new playground equipment they're installing at the sanctuary." Josh looked up from his homework with interest. "The kind Augustus designed, with the really tall climbing structures?" "Exactly like that," Margaret said, remembering Augustus's careful explanations about the psychological importance of vertical space for creatures bred to think in 3 dimensions. The federal facility had been redesigned from a containment center into something approaching a therapeutic community, complete with environmental enrichment that acknowledged the subjects' enhanced capabilities while addressing their emotional needs. The back door opened, and Augustus ducked through the frame that had been widened to accommodate his size years ago. Behind him came Patterson, looking relaxed in civilian clothes that still seemed to surprise Margaret every time she saw them. "Something smells dangerous in here," Augustus observed, eyeing the slightly blackened pancakes with theatrical concern. "Grandma was thinking about important stuff again instead of watching the stove," Emma explained matter-of-factly. "Ah." Augustus nodded solemnly. "The most dangerous kind of thinking." Margaret laughed, feeling the sound bubble up from some deep well of contentment she'd forgotten existed. Around her table, her impossible family gathered for Saturday morning breakfast. Children who'd learned that love could triumph over fear, a creature who'd chosen healing over vengeance, and even a federal agent who'd discovered that mercy could be more powerful than protocol. Outside the windows, the Olympic Peninsula stretched toward a horizon full of second chances, and for the first time in 50 years, Margaret's hands were perfectly, completely still.